project I'm working on is looking at the way modernist artists, institutions, and critics have engaged with outliers, the self-taught, the naive, the visionary, the vernacular artist, the Sunday painter, the amateur, and the outsider, and in the US in the 20th century. And of course, these terms are very problematic, and I could spend this 15 minutes discussing their various interpretations at different moments, and it's not easy to clarify this, but I think it's probably less productive than taking a slightly different track. So I want to begin with a quotation from a text that Alfred Barr, who was then the director of the Museum of Modern Art, wrote in 1943 as the foreword to a book by Sidney Janis, who was at that time a collector and an occasional curator, for a book that Janis put together called They Taught Themselves, which is something like 30 biographies of people from across the country who were self-taught, i.e. not academically taught in art schools, that gives some information about their biographies and the work they make. So this is Barr in the foreword, and I'm quoting directly. I, for one, think that just as Henri Rousseau now seems one of the foremost artists of his generation, certain of our self-taught painters can hold their own in the company of their best professionally trained compatriots. Among 20th century American painting, I do not know of a finer landscape than Joseph Pickett's Manchester Valley, a more unforgettable animal picture than Maurice Hirschfeld's Tiger, a more original metaphysical composition than Patrick Sullivan's Fourth Dimension, or a more moving portrait than John Cain's painting of himself. All of these are on one side of this sheet. This was high praise indeed for Pickett, Hirschfeld, Sullivan, and Cain, all of whom were self-taught, when you consider who were then regarded as the luminaries in the American pantheon. And, for example, Charles Sheeler, Edward Hopper, Arthur Dove, Georgia O'Keeffe, Charles Demuth, and Stuart Davis, to name just a few, though not all of them would have wanted their work to be categorized under such terms as landscape painting and animal painting and so on. Nonetheless, this is to put these artists forward as making the best works in those categories in 1943 is a very bold statement. Barr was not simply writing a personal evaluation. This was his professional opinion, a judgment that was evidenced in his role and practice as director of the Museum of Modern Art from about 1932 to 42 when he wrote this. Of course, we know that Barr was not wildly enthusiastic about American art. He was much more engaged with European modernism. Nonetheless, as director of the museum, it was his remit to present American work. And I think, though the evidence is patchy and it has to be put together carefully, I think he charted a course as, in some ways, almost as precise as that he did with his diagrams of cubism and abstract art and the lineages of vanguard modernisms that were determined by European practitioners. And in that course of activity over a decade, in my opinion, he privileged and highlighted the self-taught to a sense that hasn't been recognized. When he wrote this statement, these works were already in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and they'd largely been bought on his prompting by the fund set up by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, one of the founders of the museum. Of course, if you look at those four paintings, they're not similar to each other. It's not a homogeneous group by any means. John Cain had been born in Scotland. He aspired to go to the academy. He was extremely poor. He spent most of his working life on the railways, paving streets, doing construction work, and it was only late in his life when he began to paint and entered the academy. He won the first prize at the Carnegie International by early 1930. But this is an extraordinary self-portrait for a painter. I mean, it's an aging man whose body is presented right up front. In what's a big painting, it's about 1 meter high. Joseph Pickett, the second one, was dead. He died in 1918. He'd spent his life in the circus and odd jobs and so on, taking up his career as a painter, again very late in life, and there are only 3 works that exist, all painted in this region in Pennsylvania where he lived, and immediately that they were found, they were bought by the Modern, the Whitney, and the Newark Museum. Patrick Sullivan was alive, a contemporary artist who worked very painstakingly. This was probably only the 3rd painting he'd ever made, and he was deeply interested in the ideas espoused by Dali and de Chirico in their thinking, though obviously not in the subject matter. And Hirschfeld, the 4th of them, was a retired slipper manufacturer who was painting in his Brooklyn bedroom, who was aware of Rousseau and of contemporary avant-garde, because he was championed by Janus, and was totally dismissive about contemporary art. He thought it was... Barr not only generated shows that highlighted this work. There's an important show in 1937 of a self-taught African-American called William Edmondson, and an important show in 1938 called Masters of Popular Painting that included these artists, not Hirschfeld, and their European contemporaries. It's often been remarked that contemporary artists were very interested. It was not unusual for vanguard artists to be deeply interested in peers who were self-taught. And artists like Joseph Stella, Walt Kuhn, and many others were supportive of these artists, some of whom were trying to get into the academy and some of whom were completely indifferent. And Barr, of course, was not alone in his enthusiasm. Duncan Phillips was buying some of this work, went into the Phillips collection. Albert Barnes was buying for what became the Barnes collection, and also there was a lot of support when things became very difficult in 1943, when a solo show of Morris Hirschfeld was presented at the Museum of Modern Art, and essentially it was the last straw in that broke the camel's back, and Barr was fired. And a good deal of it had to do with the Hirschfeld show, which Janus did under Barr's aegis, which was for a long time touted as the most hated show ever at the Museum of Modern Art. And in trying to defend it to the press, which was pretty uniformly negative, Janus wrote a letter in which he said, well, you know, this is marvelous work. We know because Duchamp, Breton, Mondrian, Giacometti all supported it. And of course, for American artists who felt they were being locked out of the museum in favor of the self-taught, this was not a great way to defend the show. But there were many other emigre Europeans who were taken up with this. Léger, for example, thought that Edward Hicks was a much better artist than Rousseau. And in 1933, when Matisse made a visit to New York, he discovered Elshamius, whose work he highly regarded. When we look at how this whole phenomenon, which is raging, you might say, it's a very big thing in the 30s, how that got going, some of it is clearly the advocacy of contemporary living vanguard artists. And it's often said that the other component was the what amounted almost to a craze for classic folk art, 18th and 19th century folk art, American art, which was hoped would generate a vanguard American art in the way that African art had been to Europeans. I think this is not altogether convincing, and I wonder whether we should look at perhaps Duchamp and the way he championed the work of Elshamius when he saw it at the Society of Independent Artists in 1917. That, of course, is the place where his urinal is rejected. But he comes out strongly in front of Elshamius. The top left picture of this nymph in the stream is for him one of them, you know, he touts it as a remarkable work. And it's often thought that he was doing this with his tongue in cheek, but it seems unlikely to me, given how much effort he then put in to getting Elshamius a show in Paris, and followed by that in 1920, the first solo show at the Société Anonyme, and even more exceptionally, a second follow-up solo show in 1924. And of course, what they're looking at is the second half of Elshamius's career, because there's a big break in 1910. He'd been a professionally, conventionally trained artist in New York, who then had further training at the Atelier Julien in Paris, and painted in a manner that betrayed great interest in late Corot and, say, George Inness. In 1910, it's as if some volte-face happens and he goes about unlearning everything he knows and makes pictures that for some people were incredibly incompetent, for others were naive or grotesque and so on. And it's this body of work that Duchamp and his peers take up. And of course, after 1924, the cult for Artemis goes very fast, so that by 1930, there are shows in New York regularly. In 1939, there are 3 shows devoted to him. Critics have all turned about. He's a big figure, although still very poor, very bitter. He stopped painting in 1921, and he dies at a point. And it's in 1941 when another artist who was very interested in his work, Milton Avery, paints the picture that you see here. So all of this is going on and comes to an incredible dramatic end in 1943, as I see it, when Barr is fired. Various people die who'd supported this. The war really kicks in, and it's as if there's no interest for some time in self-taught art. When it revives again in the early 60s, it's in totally different circumstances. It's happening in regions. It's again being promoted by artists. So if you think of the Chicago imagists like Jim Nutt and that circle, they find Ramirez, Joseph Joachim, Henry Darger from Chicago. Meanwhile, in the South and the Appalachians, self-taught evangelical preachers like the Reverend Howard Finster, Sister Gertrude Morgan, and other formerly elderly African Americans, usually living in rural surroundings, like Bill Traylor was rediscovered, and many others. So there's a new understanding or new sense of what the self-taught were, and this leads to enthusiasm from artists and a great deal of contention on the part of critics and institutions who basically spend the next 20 years fighting, trying to determine which is outsider work, which is folk art work, and so on. And it's exacerbated by the entry of folklorists as professionals into the debate and art historians. And finally, by the early 90s, it consolidates into a notion that now the folk art or the self-taught world exists in parallel with contemporary art. It's not incorporated into it as Barr would have done, and Barr would have largely got rid of labels, but these labels are very entrenched, and it occupies this ongoing world, and contemporary artists are seen to kind of cherry pick from it from time to time. In 1995, the biggest exhibition of this work of the 20th century is organized now by the Museum of American Folk Art, who's taken stewardship of this, you might say. And the organizing curators are Elsa Longhauser, who'd long been interested in it, and Harold Zeman, who had been interested from the 60s in Wörthli, and whose documenta was lauded and seen as groundbreaking, in part because he brought self-taught art into the center of contemporary vanguard art. So now he's in a totally different set of circumstances where he's basically working for a folk art museum that wants to keep the two very much apart. So you have a completely different set of circumstances. And it's about this time, oddly enough, that yet another generation of artists, and I'm thinking of Mike Kelly, and later James Benning, Sharon Lockhart, Kerry James Marshall, Cara Walker, up and now through Theaster Gates, have all turned to this, and in different ways pulled on these lineages and made it a very central part of their activity for about the last 20 years. And concurrently with that, a new group, it's not a group, a new number of self-taught artists who have different profiles from anything that's gone before also come to the fore. And I'm thinking of James Castle, Judith Scott, Rosie Lee Tompkins, Morton Bartlett. Some of these people may be known to you, and they are immediately appropriated into the contemporary art world. And just as you have these two different readings going on, interestingly, the institutions who had been the first place where this work entered modernist mainstream, the Modern and the Whitney, turned their back on it. And for many of you who went to an exhibition that's closed recently at the Museum of Modern Art, which was devoted to an examination of the museum's engagement with American art in the interwar years. Some of you may have noticed there was no folk art. The institution had it, it had deaccessioned it. None of these 4 painters was present and written into their history. The whole thing has simply been erased. And similarly, if you look at the Whitney's acquisitions, exhibition history in the 70s, it was very proactive, both with classical folk art, the early pre-20th century stuff, with visionaries like Minnie Evans, with Edgar Tolson, who was part of the Biennale, and so forth. I have not seen a hang of the collection that Whitney that has referred to this in a very, very long time. So the question is, should we start to try and recuperate these histories? Should we try and go back and look at those early 20th centuries? Should we leave these artists over somewhere in the margins of the custodians of the folk art and outside of museums? Or should we, at least with the more recent figures like Castle, should we start to drop the labels and integrate them into the narratives that we are writing about the art of the present? Because in my opinion, the professional artists are saying loud and clear that we can do this. This would behoove these artists much better because, in part, when they occupy territory in the annals of the Folk Art Museum, their work is read through their biographies, and the greater the work is explained as if the life will tell you something, and even to the point where disabilities, restrictions, lack of education become markers of authenticity. I think this is a situation that does them a disservice, and would ask that in rethinking this, we go back and think about Duchamp's response and Barr's and others and bring it to the present.
Well, as an artist, I want to second all the other artists' interest in this leveling and retreat from a kind of categorization that's based on values that I certainly don't believe in. But I wanted to just for fun in a way ask a maybe ridiculously provocative question, which is that if we think about one of the things that I believe in a certain I believe as a kind of amateur person interested in history, is that when Walter Gropius announces that, or essentially denounces all of the kind of visionary aims of the Bauhaus in 1923 and declares that they are now a school of technology, one way to read this is as an act of unbelievable political cowardice, and that in the sense of, yes, in the face of very large historical forces, maybe he felt forced to do this, but in the reality that we then leave behind actually the most essential things. And is it possible to also ascribe this to Barr, in the sense that he's fired, but then he is rehired by MoMA and essentially denounces, or in some sense erases, what he had done before? And when we're thinking about the unfolding of race relations in the United States, the idea that, that Horace Pippin is the early part of Barr, and then that is gone from the later part of Barr, is it possible to read this as an incredible act of political cowardice on his part as well?
That's a charged question, and I'm probably not the person in the room with the broadest knowledge of Alfred Barr, or there are experts who could certainly speak to this. I think that Barr is so stripped of his powers and what he can do after 43. For a couple of years, he sits in the library every day and is trying to catch up on books that are overdue. And he's working on a major Picasso show, and he's allowed to hang the collection from time to time. And of course, there are no dedicated collection galleries at that point. So exhibitions are put aside and collection hangs take place. And within that remit, he starts the collection hangs consistently with Kane, usually pick at a couple of weather vanes until they're sent away, and probably a Cézanne, a post-impression. So these are seen as the grounds on which a notion of modernism will be developed. And this goes on, I think there's even an installation with a truncated version of this in '55 in a show that travels to Europe. So he doesn't, in a sense, he doesn't disavow it completely, but he certainly is said elsewhere, and he was not supported by everyone on the staff. I mean, there's a lot of other kinds of show and other people's taste that are also influencing the program, and he loses traction. And I think he makes, you can see in the acquisitions records, I can't see them because I don't work at the Museum of Modern Art, but for those who've already reported on them, it's clear that he's having an incredibly difficult time getting the things bought that he's advocating, or getting things running in the way he would prefer. So I don't think it's cowardice, and I think it's partly lack of opportunity, but the tide had turned. I mean, there was James Agee, who'd written Let Us Praise Famous Men in the early 30s, a very important book that comes out in partisan reviews saying, folk art has become entirely bourgeoisified. It is like there's nothing there for anyone to get from it. He's talking about music, but the same could be said, I think, for the crafts and certain kinds of crafts like textiles in the Upper Ages, and for the visual artists, because of all the self-taught artists who appear in the Janus show, the masterpiece of modern art, the only one who has a career after the war, and of course she doesn't have a career at the Museum of Modern Art or the Whitney because her work never appears there again, is Grandma Moses. It's a totally different idea about folk art.
Lynne, I wanted to ask you from way down near the Pig's Head, where Pig's Head was. I know this doesn't come out of the blue for you, this subject matter, but it is a significant departure in terms of research from a lot of the work you've done for many years. So I wonder if through some kind of small introspection, because I know you're always feeling what's happening at the present, whether you have a sense of your own interest in this topic or question in relation to the very present.
Yes, it absolutely comes out of the present, out of shows I'd worked on in the last couple of years. The Rosemary Trockle show would be a case in point for mixing in some of this work along with scientific models and so on that relate to abiding interests in Rosemary's work. But the Fabiola project is a project with Francis Elise that's made up of self-taught amateur, artisanal and so forth, paintings of a woman who is a saint but whose work, whose knowledge of whom is circulating outside the spectrum of the art history world or the world of theology or anthropology. It has a different circuit. But yes, it's driven by seeing what contemporary artists have responded to. I am not really interested in the field of the self-taught in and for itself. I'm absolutely interested in it through the lens of modernists, reactions and responses. And of course, there is no, I think, in some ways there's no history of the self-taught because by definition they're all monads. They don't have an evolving history. But I'm not, that for me, even so, is not where my interests lie. And the last part would be I would never have embarked upon this if I didn't have the opportunity to carry out research for 2 years. I mean, it's too big an undertaking to, and I didn't really know how big it was, of course, and without a good amount of research time.
Just to follow up, can I ask, you said there is no history because by definition these artists would be nomads, although of course there are blurry lines with...
Monads.
Monads, yeah.
Unto themselves.
Right, exactly, yeah. Monads. What you're proposing is it a history of reception, then simply?
Well, the center defines its margins. These artists were defined as belonging to the margins early on. They're the outliers, the outsiders, and so forth. And the center appropriates the margins according to its needs at certain moments, and it rejects them or ignores them at other times. So as I see it, it's a dynamic until the late 20th century that's generated constantly from the center. And although the folk art world has professionalized, and there are dedicated museums, and there are encyclopedic museums like the PMA in Philadelphia, the High, the Milwaukee Art Museum, and a couple of others who now have departments of folk art who are curated by specialists in folk art. This has nothing to do with contemporary art, and they do not cross over typically. And maybe it will change given the kind of amount of discussion going on in the light of the Venice Biennale and many other events recently.
I just had a comment to make on Duchamp's selection of Alchemias in the 1917 Independence Exhibition show, because I was mystified by it myself when I first learned about it, and kept trying to attempt to come to terms with why he selected this particular artist above all others. And I think it has not to do with his attraction to primitive or naive per se, but to the system of art that exists that allows somebody to be famous. Because remember, just a few years earlier, 5 years earlier, his brothers had rejected his nude descending a staircase. And he had made a decision right at that point in time to not be part of the art system. So what he was bucking was the system, the very system that didn't allow that picture to be shown in an exhibition because of somebody else's taste. So the whole idea of taste he was trying to get rid of and chuck out the door. And so he picks this artist who, by the way, he wasn't really untrained. He went to the National Academy of Design. Yeah, right. But he did something else. He wrote to the newspapers every single day wondering why he wasn't discovered over and over again. The guy was naive on that level. But what was he naive about? Not the history of painting or art. He's naive about the art system. And that's why Duchamp, I think, because, you know, he's not naive. He's just technically inept. He's not a good painter. I mean, period. I don't care what picture you're looking at. But he still thought he was great. And that's what Duchamp liked about him. Because remember, the Society of Independent Artists exhibition was an exhibition set up so that everybody who wanted to be an artist could be, just by submitting their $5 for an entrance fee. You submitted 2 pieces, and as I wrote in my articles about it, virtually everyone did it, it seemed, because there were over 2,000 works in the show. I don't think that's been equaled in any other subsequent exhibition. And a lot of the stuff in that show was really junk. And people were going around, like Josiah picked another picture by a woman named Dorothea Rice, called it Claire Twins, of 2 absolutely gigantic, obese women in a picture frame that they barely fit in. And he kept saying that that was the picture that everyone should identify. Why? Not because of the picture, but because of democracy in the arts. Because America had declared war on Germany right about the same time that the exhibition opened, for the sole purpose of defending American shores of democracy. And that's really why he championed that picture. At least in my mind. I could be wrong, but I think that's the initial impetus. And maybe that's the reason why we all respond to people who are untrained, because they jumped outside of the system. They didn't want to get in this art show that's behind us. They couldn't care less. They didn't want to be. And that's why I love them.
I agree with you that it's not particularly about the style of the post-1910 works that the issue, but I think you know much more about Duchamp than I do, but the idea of someone who radically reinvents himself as a klutz, and this level of individuality and singularity is surely something that would have appealed to Duchamp. And the other thing, but just to say in the 30s, not everyone is trying to stay outside or wanting to stay. Most of them would be very happy to have been bought by the Museum of Modern Art and wanted more training. Horace Pippin would be a good case, and wanted to enter into the system. It's big difference from the post-war era, post-Second War era, I think.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Stefanito. So we keep Tom Eccles.
Okay, so I believe I'm the penultimate speaker. And I'm the outlier or the outsider artist in this group. Everyone's been extremely precise and clear, historically accurate. I'm none of those. I think it's kind of interesting to hear. I've been through. I asked Josiah yesterday, why have you asked me here? What do you want me to say? He said ethics. And so maybe we'll just start with that. We're in a very weird place. You know, I mean, everybody has talked sort of around issues in a way, using the Société Anonyme as a sort of touching point of why do artists collaborate? Who are the patrons? What kind of institutions do we need? What is art at the moment of societal transformation? Where is it? Where is art? Where is what we do at a moment which Molly described as the 1920s as a moment not yet fixed, and in a moment of financial crisis as well at that time in the United States. And we're kind of at that, we seem to return to that moment. It's really interesting to hear, you know, like we go quiet for a moment. But that's the sound of reality. I ate locust for the first time yesterday while I was here. It's very interesting, it's like we're in a sort of cargo station or container port ready to take off. And then the last month, I run a school for curators, and I lead a rather strange life for someone who's involved in, supporting academia. I was in a place called Stadt last Saturday, standing on a mountainside in a very private and very wealthy resort in Switzerland. And there, Thomas Hirschhorn had posted a sign that said, "Don't hate me, hate my money." And I sort of felt like I was in some sort of like a Richard Prince bad joke, that's the one with the guy goes in to see Charles Manson in prison to interview him, and Charles Manson says, "Is it hot in here or am I crazy?" And I think one of the, obviously we're here, it's really interesting we're here. We're not only here in this physical space, but we're here because there's the money to bring us here, right? And I think as Molly said, we all know someone, but we don't know everyone here. These meetings are very, very important. This is, in fact, I think the concept of why we're here, and why we were invited by Montserrat and Josiah, both of whom have tried to create artistic communities or cultural communities, intellectual communities. And so trying to kind of put my pinpoint what it is that makes it special enough for us all to want to be here, and what is it they actually, why did they choose this topic? Well, of course, there's a double-edged sword. We live in very paradoxical times. On the one hand, we want to really participate and be protagonists in our world, and to support the artists and cultural thinkers who we believe in. On the other, we want to create societies, areas, zones, if you like, of resistance, and places which are, to some extent, protected. And in doing so, we're often driven into the bosom of wealth, obviously, and it's an extremely tight embrace. It's funny, I started in New York when Rudolph Giuliani was mayor. And Giuliani once said to me, I don't like you. And I said, I don't like the Yankees. And it was interesting that when Mayor Bloomberg came in, the embrace of power was much, much tighter than the rejection. and much harder to work with. And I think we're sort of in this mode right now. We're sort of we're in the container port, not quite sure where we're going to go next. So I think what Josiah just wanted me to say a little bit about was how we're with artists, why we're with artists, and what might be. I mean, I'm working currently on a project thinking about what might be an institution for the future. The straightforward answer is I've got no idea whatsoever. But I started out in the Public Art Fund in New York, and which was interesting because it was neither public nor a fund. In fact, it had no money whatsoever. And I invited an artist, Rachel Whiteread, at the time to come to New York, and we, in a sense, a little like Michael's reversals, projects always started with a site and a budget. Usually a rather bad site and a very inadequate budget. And so we said, okay, why don't we just throw that out? We'll start with you as an artist, and let's take this on a kind of journey wherever it goes. And I was very fortunate to work with Molly and Lynne and Michael and others who were very supportive of this at the time. Ultimately, we decided upon a project which was in fact to cast a water tower in translucent resin and place it atop on the truss of an old water tank in Soho, which at the time the whole art world was in fact receding from. Roberta Smith said the piece ultimately was like a snake shedding its skin. And it was a piece that was actually removed from the public sphere, was upon a rooftop that actually kind of adapted to its conditions, sometimes was highly visible, often quite invisible, was unmarked in the place you needed to seek out. But to all intents and purposes, was still very much a public, as in a free and open and available work that could be experienced over time. But it needed the audience itself to actually seek it out, and that seemed to me kind of very, very important. I remember I was appalled with Michael Govan years ago when he said to me, "Dear," actually said, I think he started charging $8. I was like, $8 for a hand-it-down Woven exhibition, and he said, "Yeah, we're now charging so we have less visitors," and. That, for me, actually, and this was quite some time ago. I'm sure Michael doesn't see that today, but actually, it seems rather important and rather significant. And actually, I think one of the reasons why I liked the Deer Art Centre was precisely because it was a place where I was somewhat alone with works, and really something that challenged me. It was something I didn't know. It wasn't all there for me, and it was uncomfortable getting there. And it was funny after Michael left and then Lynne left. There was a complete crisis at the Deer Art Centre. We had a board retreat, and one board member said to me, "What's wrong with Deer?" I said, "Nothing's wrong with Deer." It's actually like. Deer is exactly what it should be, and in many ways in the institutions we work in today, there's this constant kind of consumer marketed reports that come in, and I know that Michael deals with it. I don't deal with it very much, but I deal with people who deal with it, and that years ago Francesco Bonami did every Venice Biennale has a very funny title. And Francesco Bonami had one called Dictatorship of the Viewer. And I didn't know what that meant, but actually we seem to live under the dictatorship of the viewer today. And, I think to some extent why we're sort of digging out this history, which is really not about the viewer, but about the protagonist making the work, being within a community, and then controlling to some extent through patronage and through some systems of power, through Dryer and others, the Brooklyn Museum, to then presenting their work, also for the mystification of the viewer, the challenge of the viewer. And so a lot of the times in my practice, I showed some images here. One was Pierre Huyghe. Pierre came to me and said, "I want to go to the Antarctic." and then I want to seek out an albino penguin, and then I would like to recreate that event in Central Park, and then make a film of that. So, and which of course I said absolutely, and the question for a lot of us, another project was with Francis Elise, where Francis Elise, shortly after 9/11, he came to me. He said, well, if we talk to MoMA, then it's become a problem. I want to do this procession, and I want to borrow La Demoiselle d'Avignon, Giacometti's Standing Woman, and Duchamp's bicycle wheel, and also have a living icon, and carry these in a procession through Midtown Manhattan, over the bridge, and into Queens, where the temporary home of MoMA will be. And in this case, it was quite interesting in terms of collections. You know, approaching MoMA, so we'd like to borrow La Demoiselle d'Avignon, the Giacometti's Standing Woman, and Duchamp's bicycle wheel, which in fact, the Duchamp bicycle wheel that MoMA has is not the bicycle wheel, but another bicycle wheel. But, and they, you know, of course, said absolutely not. For the insurance values. I said, well, you know, but the Duchamp, the Giacometti Standing Woman is a bronze sculpture. It could sit in the garden. You know, we'll have a lot of police. We'll have a police helicopter. Will be more protected now than it is in the museum. The Demoiselle d'Avignon, we could put in the back of a taxi cab. It wouldn't be the first time a group of whores have been in the back of a New York taxi cab. And then we said, oh no, we couldn't possibly have it in the back of a New York taxi cab. So, well, look, the reality is it's a rather big painting and it wouldn't fit in the back of a taxi cab. And we went through numerous discussions about they had to move this work from the Museum of Modern Art to the site in Queens anyway. So we said, let's just get a container. We'll put them in the container like a kind of golden calf. And we'll carry the container. And it became more and more clear as we went through this, it became like a kind of like the Spanish Inquisition. You know, and in fact the architecture of the Museum of Modern Art is quite like the Vatican. You know, with the Pope on top, the cardinals, village priests, some little wayward, you know, the occasional Martin Luther. And so ultimately the Museum of Modern Art decided that they have now decided. I got the notice of this. They decided the Museum of Modern Art would never commission an artist to make a work about the collection, but could acquire a work by an artist who had made a work about the collection. No, and so it's kind of like so. In that case, it was very interesting for me to be working very much with an artist, alongside an artist, as the advocate for the artist, in relation to a major institution like the Museum of Modern Art. And someone brought up earlier, I think in the case of Yale and loans and what have you, who actually owns this work? I think it's a very important debate for us to have. You know, right now, not right now, but like at this present time, who owns this work? Because my attitude is that actually we own that work. You know, but the work in the Museum of Modern Art we own, not the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art. And it comes to a debate which is very kind of important right now as to where we are. The fact we're here, we're in Mexico City, and I'm not one to bite the hand that feeds me. You know, we're obviously here with the support of UMEX, for which we're very grateful, but there's been this incredible accumulation of private collections, the development of private museums, now the almost kind of territorial gains that the accumulation of wealth have made on the public sphere, which is, you know, of course, very, very prevalent within the sphere in which we work and on which we depend. And so, you know, we've kind of like reverted back in many ways to that moment which Molly called not yet fixed, but damn, it's getting fixed fast. And And so maybe I'll just sort of end. I mean, I've worked at a place called the Hesse Museum with the Hesse Collection, working with artists to develop exhibitions around the collection through their work, working with artists like Josiah McElheny, curators like with Lynne Cooke, for example, where we've tried quite radical approaches to exhibition presentation of models, similar to Michael. In a way, those strategies weren't built around conceits. They were built around prying the private over to the public and asking what we hope were very kind of public questions of private resources. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
You want me to comment on the admission story? Yeah. Just to clarify, and Lynne knows this, at that time it was an interesting phenomenon because the galleries had invaded our privacy, right, Lynne? And we had an interesting phenomenon where people would come to DIA because they couldn't use the bathroom in all the galleries. And they would sort of wreck the place without actually seeing the art. And so this was our little effort to just simply require that they make an effort. Right? So there's an interesting dynamic about how that happened and how we were swallowed within the field of, the commercial art world, which offered its art for free, its admission for free, but of course with a high tax on the system. And that's what we found ourselves within, which was an interesting conundrum, which eventually led to a little bit of a crisis, not of identity for the institution, but of site and situation over time. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? I mean, you were there during that time. And also Tom was, right? You were reading that as well.
So this is going to be the close of the event today. I hope you'll finish the dessert. I'm going to begin by handing out a little souvenir. This is a draft of an artwork. You can get for free later the final artwork, so you don't need to save this, but if you want to save it, you can save it. There's English copies and there's some Spanish copies. So please take one and enjoy.
Michael, as a mea culpa, how much did you get paid for coming to this?
So as I said, I'm going to make an
symposium?
announcement.
Zero. Okay.
Society. A society. Societies.
And you
Your
choose it.
society. Their society. Our society. I would like to announce today the beginning of a new society and tell you a little bit about its hopes and its development. The name of this society is the Society for Prismatic Culture. What is the Society of Prismatic Culture? At its core, it is a proposal to form a, quote, society based on the idea that there may be a strand of cultural thought and effort that could be termed prismatic, and that so-called prismaticness could be defined as something that generates multiplicity from what appears to be singular. Colorfulness is, of course, also implied. Further definition of the philosophical, temperamental, or emotive qualities of this society is, at this point, non-existent. The reason being that another essential character of the society is that its implications and desires can be understood from its name alone. The Society of Prismatic Culture is whatever you or I or we imagine it to be, what is needed in the moment, now, today, or tomorrow. The structure of the society is simple. Anyone can declare their membership at any time, in moments of urgency or moments of quiet. There are no meetings, no records, simply the possibility of belonging and furthering the imaginative. You have in front of you a page of colored letters, a prism for language. This is an early draft of the certificate of membership that will be available this spring to anybody who finds it on the Society's website. I urge you to join. You can join today or tomorrow. So now that's my official announcement and statement. And so at this moment, which is 4:37, February 8th, is the historical beginning of the Society for Prismatic Culture. So you can say you were here. I want to tell you just a little bit about the history. Just take me 2 more minutes of how the society has come into being. It comes from an ongoing sense that echoes very much some of the things that Tom said about a feeling of the difficult position we exist in, especially in my case as somebody who is involved on an ad hoc basis with teaching, where the questions of urgency overall and questions of community seem central to any engagement with so-called students, or who might also be termed fellow colleagues. I saw in the fall Judith Butler speak at Cornell University upon her return from Turkey, where she had become a kind of de facto spokesman for some of the most radical thinking around taking power in Turkey. And she gave a lecture on the notion, we the people, in which she said essentially that no group of people, however large, can ever claim to be we the people or to speak for the we the people. I found this very depressing. Then I met a friend of mine in New York at a gallery opening in November who had been very involved in Occupy Wall Street. And he said that we were talking about the problem of our moment, the many problems of our moment. And he said something that sort of shook me. I wish I could have a recording of it so that you would understand the feeling behind it. But he said that at the end of Occupy, when the park was cleared, he had this feeling of optimism that maybe they didn't need a space, that basically that Occupy could exist on the web, and that Occupy could be simply a community that existed. And with a kind of great pathos in his voice, he came to explain that he no longer believed this and was feeling extremely displaced. The third source of this history is a project I'm working on intimately right now about a strange writer named Paul Scheerbart. Both Bruno Taut and Walter Benjamin described what they termed in Scheerbart an infinite humanity. I find this phrase very captivating. As a way of understanding a little bit about Scheerbart and maybe also the Society Anonyme, one of my favorite quotes discussing Scheerbart was written by a friend of his named Georg Heck in 1912, in which he said, when Scheerbart's scholars gather together, something arises among them, a great collective silence. And then the last source of making this announcement today and the opening of the society is that to be invited by Montserrat to participate with all of you in a discussion of these ideas. So thank you very much.